you're seeing a story blasted in your face that somebody's made a ton of money on some investment that they shouldn't have made. And just want people to realize that that is rare. I know it doesn't sound like it's rare, but the odds of somebody doing that are very, very slim. Less than, you're probably more likely to get struck by lightning. And not only that, even if you were struck by lightning and became instantly wealthy, you're more likely to lose that money because of the way you acquired it without having good fundamentals. So
That's a
long term,
huge point. Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt, but
no,
I
you're
really
fine.
have to emphasize that right now. The fact that you are more likely to lose your money if you make it engaging in risky behavior.
Yep.
In fact, that's a topic for a future episode right there.
The Purposeful Podcast.
Welcome to this episode of the Purposeful Podcast. I'm Matt.
I am Saki.
We are really happy to have you here today with us. And we're going to talk about real estate investing. But before we do, man, how's Philadelphia treating you?
It's treated me pretty good. I can't complain too bad.
I kind of feel like there's a butt coming on somewhere.
Well, for all of our listeners out there, even Greek people named Psyche aren't immune to the COVID-19 virus. I have recently tested positive, but the effects I'm experiencing aren't too bad, so I can't complain.
You're right. Omicron strikes again, right?
Exactly. It's all over the place up here. And granted, it was a little warmer today. It hit the 30s and got above the freezing mark, but it's been pretty cold here.
Yeah. Well, I checked the weather a little while ago, and even here in Northwest Florida, tomorrow night we're supposed to dip into the 20s, and then Friday, man, is high in the high 30s or low 40s. So it's going to be a little chilly down here too. But
I will say that I was very surprised, and I'll get off my soapbox after I say this, but I had to bring it up. I was watching the news earlier, and our great state of Florida is actually one of the only states that is actually receding or declining in the number of COVID cases across the country.
There you go.
Yep.
Well, we're one of the only states where you can actually go outside right now and be relatively comfortable. So that might have something to do with it.
That doesn't hurt.
No, I mean, the transmissible diseases transmit a lot more quickly when, you're in tight, enclosed spaces around a lot of other people. So
Agreed.
I guess when it's cold, those are the ideal conditions, right?
That's it.
Anyway, well, we appreciate y'all being with us. Hope y'all are doing well also. And like we said, we're going to talk about real estate investing. Specifically, if you're a new investor, or if you are considering investing, we're going to go over some things that you definitely want to know before you get started. But before we get into that, we're going to kick this out to the intro.
You're listening to the Purposeful Podcast with Matt Fiebig and Psyche Filios.
All right, brother. So I'm going to pose this to you in the form of a question. Now, you're more involved in real estate than I am. So hopefully, for a change, our audience is going to hear a little bit more from you today than they do from me. But let me start it off with this question. If you could give only 3 recommendations to a new real estate investor based on your own experience, what would those 3 be?
Well, that's a great question. And I've got 3 recommendations for everyone here. Let me first say, I'm going to apologize in advance because I am a little under the weather. So I do have a throat lozenge in my mouth. So if somebody hears that, that's what it is. And if I sound a little raspy or I'm hard to understand, that's why. So just work with me here throughout this episode. I'm trying to fight my way through it here.
All right, man. We'll hang with you since you're hanging with us.
Very good. Well, I appreciate that. So I'm a big fan of investing in real estate. And I would have to say probably my top three recommendations would be: number one, identify what are you ready for investing in real estate? Are you ready for that portfolio? And there's a couple things in that we'll unpack as we move forward. But so are you ready? Meaning, what do you know what type of property you want to invest in? Do you know if you want to self-manage? And then number two, I would say that you need to identify how you plan on paying for these properties. You need a game plan going in. Are you planning on cash? Are you planning on owner or seller financing? Or do you want bank financing? And then number three, I would say, and some of you may have heard this, don't fall in love with a property, right? We need to make sure we keep emotions out of it.
Yeah, I think all three of those are great pieces of advice and well worth unpacking. So let's start with that first one. You talk about being ready to get involved in real estate investing. So what components are important when you're considering your readiness? Like what boxes, so to speak, would you want to check to say, okay, I'm at least reasonably prepared to get my feet wet in this market?
Okay, so first and foremost, what falls under that category is I think a lot of people have the mindset that real estate is a passive investment. So there are varying degrees of passiveness, I guess you would say, when it comes to real estate. Yeah, it could be a little more passive or it could be a little less passive. And that's a lot of factors involved in what determines that. But I don't really believe that there's quite any investment that is completely passive. So when you get involved in real estate investing, understand that it's going to probably involve more time than you realize if you're green, if you're new to this. So accept the fact that you're going to have to put some time into it. And then you're going to want to decide what type of properties you want to look for. Are you more interested in residential properties or commercial properties, institutional properties? There's a lot of different segments of properties, and we can unpack that. I mean, we can do a deep dive in that, but for the purposes of this podcast segment, we don't really have the time for that. I mean, every category has subcategories. So you just want to decide which category you want to get into over time. You'll hone that skill and that desire. Me personally, I'm not a big fan of single detached residential properties. So I kind of lean towards commercial properties at the moment in this market. And also it's okay to keep in mind that change in markets might determine what properties you like to be involved in. And then the other part of that is, do you want to manage these properties? Do you want to self-manage them, or are you going to hire somebody to manage them for you, like a property management company? That's a big decision to know before you actually put in an offer, because it's going to affect your cash flow and your return.
What kind of an investor would be looking for commercial property? Like why personally did you go that route? Or do you prefer that at this time as opposed to single family residential?
So the reason I went to commercial property is I feel like in a hot market like we've had for the past, it's probably going to be, say, 2012 in most areas, give or take. So we're running on 10 years now for a rebounding and growing market. But on the residential side, I think you deal with a lot more phone calls from your tenants. And in almost all cases, you're going to be the one who has to do the repairs and the maintenance there. Very small percentage of residential leases does the tenant cover a hot water malfunctioning or breaking, kitchen appliances that need to be repaired. So typically that falls on the landlord as well as the taxes and the insurance. Well, the commercial side, when the market's average to above average, you can actually shield that responsibility from and change it. You can take it. I guess the proper word would be shift. You would shift the responsibility from the landlord owner to the actual tenant and do what's called a triple net lease in a lot of cases, where the tenant is responsible to pay for the taxes, insurance, and most of the upkeep.
So if I had to boil that down probably to its most simple form, what you're saying is that commercial is probably more passive than residential real estate. So you have less day-to-day required from you on the commercial side.
In most cases, yes. Obviously, all markets are going to be different geographically, depending what part of the country you're in. But typically, a commercial setting will require less of your time. And, but coincidentally, you might not quite get such a good return on it, but also more so than that, it would require a little bit more money. Usually the entry to barrier is a little more than a single family house.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask that next, is what's the barrier to entry on commercial versus residential? So is there like a rule of thumb or some sort of proportion, like, it takes 3 or 4 times as much in terms of resources for a commercial unit, or all of that is too dependent on the local market?
Most of it's too dependent on the local market. There used to be rules of thumb you could come close to, and one of them was 10%. If you could return 10% of your money annually, you're doing good. Or if you can make your money back in 10 years on a property, that was a ballpark gauge that you were in a good investment. Some investors will scour for deals where they need a return in a shorter time. They might want 6 years. So there's a lot of factors there.
Is that based on the purchase price? So in other words, if you were to purchase a property for $300,000, then you're looking to either recoup that in that $300,000 in 6 years or 10 years?
Yeah, correct. Obviously, you could factor in holding cost if you were mortgaging a property, and any outlay and cost you have, depending if you were paying taxes and insurance or the tenant was and all that. So typically you like to calculate that number on the net income that you have off a property. So let's say you paid 300,000 and you were renting it for 5,000 a month, which meant 60,000 a year. But then it cost you 30,000 a year to manage that property or maintain it or what have you. So you would use that $30,000 figure that was left over, which would get you to that 10-year mark.
Okay. Now you mentioned there that maybe your return on investment might not be quite as high in terms of cash flow from the commercial side as it is on the residential side. Is that because residential is more labor intensive?
Correct. You typically put in a little bit more time on the residential side, but you can also, your barrier to entry can be lower. There's a whole segment of people, for example, that might be in the mobile home leasing market, where they can buy 5 acres of land and throw 4 mobile homes per acre and rent them out for $550 a month. Well, on paper, their return is going to be a lot higher of a percentage than I am on a commercial property.
Right.
Now, granted, their time is probably going to be dramatically higher as well, but it's the same thing, right? I mean, it's just like anything else in life. Typically, more time, more reward. If you don't get that, then you better sell.
Well, I think that's important, because if you're a new investor or you're thinking about getting invested in real estate, that's a consideration. Maybe this is something that's going to be a part-time project for you. And if you only have, 5 or 10 hours a week, that may dictate that you need to go with something that's a little bit more passive. So commercial might be the way to go in your situation. If you're in a position where you can devote whatever time is necessary, then residential might be good because you might, get a higher return on your investment. So those are definitely things to consider for those folks that are interested in getting involved in that. So um, let's talk next about the financing issues. So what is something that a new investor ought to know when they're considering financing? I mean, I know this is a hot button issue right now because looks like interest rates are going to probably be going up some this year. And, you may have a lot of folks looking to borrow money before that happens. So is that even a good idea?
Yeah, so we will probably see our interest rates go higher as the year moves on, and it may start sooner rather than later. But um, I can speak about me personally. If we're talking about new investors, and I just think everyone needs to be real careful. Obviously, the market's been piping hot, right? We're in just a tremendously hot market right now. Prices might be a hair inflated, and money's fairly easy to come by. So just make sure when you're running your numbers, if you are going to finance, that it makes sense, that you can afford the note. Now, my recommendation, obviously, is to always pay cash if you can. And I love real estate. And if you can't pay cash, then I would stick to conventional means of financing. I think owner and seller financing is, I call it owner seller just because it's the seller is the owner, but seller financing is what it turns out to be, is a good option in a lot of cases if that seller is willing to hold the note. And obviously, if you can do a 10 or 15 year tops on investment properties, all I would recommend a conventional, non adjustable fixed rate loan on it. I wouldn't do 30-year on investment, unless, of course, you're going with some very expensive property, but that's still a long time and a lot of interest paid that you got to overcome. So
Right.
they would be what I would stick to. I wouldn't do any adjustable rate mortgages, or I wouldn't leverage any other assets I have, to pay for new assets. I would stay away from anything that's fancy. If a 10-year-old doesn't understand it, you probably shouldn't be using it for your financing.
Well, I think about the last market crash that we did go through back in, 08, 09. That was a really significant crash. And leverage was a big deal back then. A lot of folks saw the market, and the market at the time was appreciating so quickly that interest only loans, especially short term adjustable rate mortgages, those sorts of products were really popular back then because it allowed for maximum leverage, right? I mean, you can afford a greater payment if you're only paying interest versus a combination of interest and principal. So that let people bid up the prices even higher. And the assumption was, well, hey, if I buy it now, it's going to appreciate 10 to 20% a year. So if I hold it for 3 or 4 or 5 years, which a 3-year ARM and a 5-year ARM were very popular products back at that time, they felt like it was not even very risky because,
Yeah.
if you borrow and you know that the property is going to be worth, 150% of what you pay for it now in 3 years or 5 years, then is it even really a risk to pay only interest on the loan? Because in the end, you're going to walk away with the increase in the value that is realized over that period. Well, the problem is what happens when prices stop going up? You're making a pretty heavy commitment based on an assumption that may not come to pass. And that's what happened when the market crashed, is people realized, oh, okay, well, I can't pay my mortgage, and there are no more buyers who are willing to pay 10, 20% more than what I paid for this property. And so I'm just going to stop paying on my note. And then all of a sudden the market becomes flooded with foreclosure properties, which actually depresses prices. And then boom, we had what we had in 08 and 09. So the problem with leverage, I think, boils down to you're kind of playing Russian roulette with your financial future. You may end up in a great place, and you make more on the margin if you over leverage yourself, but you also risk losing absolutely everything, right? It's kind of like the baseball player who is swinging for the home run. They're way more likely to strike out, but they will hit a home run from time to time. Baseball, that's fine. But when you're talking about your financial security and your financial future, striking out can be a pretty severe consequence. So you got to be really careful about that. I think, that really gets to your point about paying cash if it's possible. And if it's not possible, conventional financing, stick to, the shortest reasonable terms possible. In other words, pay off the debt as fast as you can, right?
Exactly. Back in what you were talking about, 08, 09, you were spot on. And what happened is everybody thought, the getting was good, and they didn't think it was going to ever change. And what they ended up with is negative amortization is what happened, where, and if our listeners don't know what that is, it's where they ended up actually, like you said, they owed more than the house was worth because they were doing interest only payments. And they figured in a couple years they'd refinance when that 3-year adjustable rate they locked in changed. Well, to be honest with you, I don't know what they thought. I mean, I don't know if they thought they would get a cheaper rate. When you look at it on paper and you look back, I'm curious to know what their real estate agents told him, which is something I wanted to bring up in this point. If you're a new investor, I can't stress enough how important it is to form a relationship and retain the services of a professional real estate agent / broker. I'm not saying you can't do it yourself, and that's perfectly fine. That's what I do. But in the beginning, when I was new to real estate, when I first started buying properties, I went through a bunch of them. I've had relationships with a lot of agents, both residential, commercial, but I retained the services of ones that I trusted, and they have helped guide me to where I am today, to where I now utilize my own services now that I've gotten to this point. But without their help in the beginning, there was a lot of mistakes I would have made that I didn't make because they were there.
Well, I think that's a great point, and that may be one that we need to explore in greater depth at another time. But it applies not just to real estate either. I mean, form relationships with other people, get help. That's just good advice. That's good advice for your personal life. That's good advice for your business. That's just good advice. The more intelligent people that you can source on a given problem, the better solution that you're going to come up with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and
they get paid to do it.
You're leveraging everybody's area of expertise. And in a way, you're putting yourself in a position where everybody can succeed better together than any one would be able to succeed alone.
Correct.
So that's definitely something to think about. Well, let's move on and talk about the final piece of advice, and possibly the, at least from where I sit, possibly the most important one, which would be keeping your emotions out of it, not falling in love with the property, whatever you want to say about it. But yeah, I mean, the emotional side of things can really get you in some trouble if you're not careful. So tell us about that.
It's gotten me in trouble before, but luckily, it wasn't a big deal for me. It was a small property, but I love real estate, as I'm sure a lot of our listeners do. And it's very easy to get emotional, not just about real estate, about anything, about investing in general. It's fun, right? It brings out, the whole point of it is, you've done your due diligence, you've done your work, and you find something that generated money without you having to go punch a clock. Who doesn't enjoy the aspect or idea of that? You're making something out of nothing, so it's great. But when you're investing in real estate, you really have to be disciplined and learn that it's about the numbers. And you'll walk through a property, we think it talks to us and it's making us feel a certain way, and we just got to have it. But then when you leave and you go run the numbers, it tells a different story. And so that's something we have to keep in mind. You got to be able to rent the property out, and you've got to be able to make a return on it.
This is going to sound a little crazy, but you'll have to bear with me for a minute. So this topic kind of reminds me of alcohol. Okay, because the effect that alcohol has on your brain, or at least one of the effects, is to reduce the part of your brain that controls your inhibition. And so if you're not inhibited from doing things that you know are risky, then you're more willing to do things that are dangerous, right? And so that's why alcohol can be so dangerous, because when people drink too much, they do things that they otherwise wouldn't do, because their tolerance for risk goes way higher and their inhibition goes way lower. And falling in love and getting, super emotional about something can have a similar effect, right? So
Sure.
you fall in love with a place, and all of a sudden the numbers don't matter as much, right? Oh, I can make them work.
Exactly.
The fundamentals may not add up, but man, there's just, I have this feeling about this place. It clicks. It speaks to me, right?
Yeah.
You hear people talk like that a lot. And the property may speak to you, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure that, if you've got the property on this shoulder whispering sweet nothings into your ear, consult with the numbers on this shoulder and make sure that the fundamentals are speaking to you as well. Because if you're not careful, you find yourself in trouble in a hurry. So
Yeah, well, that's it. Unless you're doing this as a charitable organization, which I'm sure there's a very small percentage that are doing that. I'm sure they're out there, but it's a very small percentage. Your point here is to make your quality of life better and to make money. So
right.
that's first and foremost where it has to come from. And another thought behind keeping emotions out of it is, believe it or not, just as equally important, if not more, is the patience aspect of it. We fall in love with properties, they talk to us, or we just getting tired of looking at properties and we're just ready to start, right? This is the third property I've looked at, and I'm ready to start becoming a millionaire with passive real estate investment income. I get it. I want to get started too, but I'll be honest with you, just to give you an idea, and I am a little bit more conservative than most. but I am an active broker agent, and I am an active real estate uh, investor, excuse me. And in this market, with the way the prices are, I mean, it's not like I'm looking at 5 properties and I'm buying one. I probably look at 200 properties before I buy one. And when I say look at 200, I probably visit or look at the raw numbers of at least 100 of them before I buy one. It's just that hard to find something in a market that's this hot in a lot of areas that the numbers actually make sense.
Yeah, and I personally have mixed feelings about this issue, um, because I kind of expect prices to continue going up for the foreseeable future because we've kind of entered this inflationary period in the economy. And it can be a self-perpetuating cycle, right? People begin to expect that prices are going to be higher, so they value the present more than the future because it's like what happened prior to 08 and 09, right? People expect prices are going to continue to go up, so they're
Exactly.
willing to pay more. And money is cheap right now, so people are willing to borrow more and pay more because they anticipate that the values are going to increase. I think if you look at it from a fundamentals perspective, um, real estate's an interesting investment, right? Because it works for you in two distinctly different ways, right? So you've got monthly rental income, or you could even look at it as annual, however you want to break down the time period. But if it's an investment property that is more than just a piece of land, so either it's going to be occupied by a resident that's living there, or it's going to be occupied by a business that's doing business there, it's going to be generating rental income for you. So you've got the rental income aspects to look at it. But then the second issue is the value of the property itself is likely over a very long period of time to appreciate. Now, the market is going to fluctuate up and down in the short term, but the long-term prospects for real estate typically have been pretty good. So, the fact that property appreciates over time generally means that you want to buy sooner rather than later, because the longer you wait, the more the property is going to appreciate. That's what tugs at my heartstrings. So, I listen to you because you're, more of an expert in this field than I am. And you bring it back to, yeah, well, are you going to be able to return your investment in 6 years or 10 years, or at the prices that we're paying right now versus maybe say the rents that you're getting? Do those numbers get out of whack and maybe it's a 15 or a 20-year deal? So that always reminds me that there's that other side of the picture that I need to look at, the cash flow side. And I bring that up specifically because this is tough for me. I have a lot of motivation right now to buy whatever I can get my hands on because I'm looking at it as opportunity lost if I'm waiting. But the advantage of doing it the way that you're doing it is, if my way would be good, your way would be better, because you're going to maximize your cash flow opportunity, and you're going to continue to realize the appreciation over time. So I think it's important to factor both sides of the equation in when you're making that decision.
Yeah, you're 100% correct. And, I'm glad you brought that up because I think a lot of people resonate, and a lot of our audience resonate with what you just said. Um, kind of the term of the new year here so far that I keep seeing everywhere is FOMO, right? It's a fear of missing out.
Right.
And that's what we're all suffering from. And there's even a part of me that suffers from that, because you've got to accept that you're going to miss deals when you take the mentality that I do. And I've accepted that. But you know what? I've read books from a lot of great investors over time, some that have made it, some that haven't. And I'm a value guy. I'm a long-term guy. I don't necessarily go for home runs. I've discovered for myself that I don't need home runs if I keep building step by step with a long-term view on things, that it's turned out a lot better for me. So that's how I keep my eye on the prize, that every year I'm making good steps forward as opposed to having to have years where I'm taking steps back. But I wanted to touch on what you were talking about. It is, it's not just a real estate market. It's cryptocurrencies. It's the stock market. It's NFTs. It's whatever investment right now. Because every time you turn on Yahoo or Google or the news, you're seeing a story blasted in your face that somebody's made a ton of money on some investment that they shouldn't have made. And just want people to realize that is rare. I know it doesn't sound like it's rare, but the odds of somebody doing that are very, very slim. Less than, you're probably more likely to get struck by lightning. And not only that, even if you were struck by lightning and became instantly wealthy, you're more likely to lose that money because of the way you acquired it without having good fundamentals. So
that's
long
a
term,
huge point. Sorry to interrupt, but
no,
I
you're
really
fine.
have to emphasize that right now. The fact that you are more likely to lose your money if you make it engaging in risky behavior.
Yep.
In fact, that's a topic for a future episode right there.
You're right.
Because it's kind of like winning the lottery, right?
Yep.
Most people who win the lottery are broke and miserable within a few years because they don't have the fundamentals in place to manage the money that they just won. And when you go about doing things the right way and you build it incrementally and you behave with discipline, you are much more likely to keep what you make instead of losing it. Because if you win that money in a reckless fashion, you're going to be much more likely to continue to engage in reckless behavior. And the risk that you have of losing everything is a lot higher when you're engaging in that kind of behavior. So, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that was just like, if you hear nothing else but that's the thing to walk away from with this episode.
Well, you're right. And, that was the big repercussion from 07, 08, 09 when the bottom fell out of it. And there's a lot of people that committed suicide, lost their lives over this because they were so over leveraged. They didn't even want to be alive anymore. I don't want that to happen to me or anybody listening here. I want everybody to be able to stay in the game. So invest intelligently. You don't need home runs. Keep a long-term view. I made one of my biggest rules. I don't have many rules. I have some, but on the investing side, I wrote down my rules a long time ago, and obviously I change them as time moves on. But my number one rule was never to invest in anything that would break me, and the way I put that down on paper, just so our audience knows that, and it may be different for everybody, but this is what worked for me, is I told myself I would never invest more than 50% of my liquidity, my available capital that I had at the time in any single deal. So just for the sake of our conversation, if I had $50,000 lying around to my name, I wasn't going to invest 30,000 of that in one deal. And like I said before, that's a little more conservative, but that's just a specific example you can tailor it to whatever your needs are, but that's what worked for me.
Outstanding. Well, given the time, I think that's a good place to wrap up. But there's a lot here that is rich topical material for future episodes. So for our listeners, for our viewers, we certainly appreciate your time. Glad that you joined us. Hope that you will join us again. If you're listening to us on YouTube or Rumble, please subscribe. If you are listening to us on your favorite podcast directory, please subscribe through there. Leave us feedback anywhere you can. It certainly is helpful to us, and we appreciate it. And most importantly of all, we really value your feedback. And if you've got something that you'd like to share, a story you'd like to tell, a question that you'd like to ask, please reach out. You can do that at the Purposeful Podcast at convergentdigitalmedia.com. We will get right back with you. We definitely appreciate you being here with us and look forward to having you join us next time on the Purposeful Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Purposeful Podcast with Matt Fiebig and Saki Filios. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to join us on Locals at thepurposefulpodcast.locals.com and find us on YouTube and Rumble by searching for the Purposeful Podcast. If you like this podcast, don't forget to rate and review. This has been a production of Convergent Digital Media. Visit convergentdigitalmedia.com for more info. Thanks again for listening to the Purposeful Podcast.